Started in about 3 minutes, and I still have to do some technological stuff up here. But what? Go ahead and let's get started with you getting talking. And so maybe get with 2 or 3 people around you. And if you read the first 7 chapters, let's talk about some of the things that you noticed in those chapters. You don't have to understand them, they can just be questions. But what were some of your observations? It was gonna be really hard. This one we're operational now. So let me hear from some of your observations, just two or three. I know we're not getting in there in terms of our content, but what were some of the things that you noticed? Just go ahead and shout it out. You who have ears to hear. You who have ears to hear, like he who has ears to let him hear. So that continues to come up over and over again, especially in the letters to the churches. That's what we need. The letters were different for each church. The letters were different for each church, right? So they talk about the specific needs of each church. We're going to get into that today. Maybe one more observation.
Right, I was noticing in first chapter, where it says blessed is the one who reads, but it doesn't say blessed is the one who understands, so I'm glad they there.
Hears these words, and we see that come up more than one time, but yes, it doesn't say that much about understanding at all. So that's all really good.
So there's 144,000 that are seals.
144,000 that are sealed, right?
Yeah.
That definitely happened.
So that word I
And we'll talk about that now. It just, I see how we can stay. So the handout that I gave you goes over what we talked about last week. And then if you turn it over, you'll see that I just give a slight overview of what is going to happen chapter by chapter. You can write notes on that, and then I'll provide more as we continue to make our way forward. But this just kind of gives you a little bit of overview. The other thing that I have for you that I didn't have enough time to give is a QR code that will link to all of these slides so that you can take a look at the slides too. So I have that. It's just yeah, it's just not ready to go. So we read Revelation 1 last week, and then this week what we're going to be talking about mostly is the letters to the 7 churches, but hopefully we'll get a little bit farther than that. We'll see how we do. So let's talk about these letters to the 7 churches, and here you can see a map of what is modern day Turkey. So if you can think of Greece as being here, this is the coast of Turkey. And these are where those 7 churches are. And I think, although I've never been to this part of the world, but I think you can still take a tour and see most of the areas and if anybody's ever done that, we'd love to hear a little bit more about it. Oh, great. So maybe we'll hear about a little bit more about that later. But it's helpful to know that what this area sort of represents is a major trade route. So it exists along an area where, and you can think of it as kind of the Roman Empire is continuing to expand, right? Italy is going to be way, way the heck over there. And the Roman Empire is continuing to expand. And as they expand, they have to continue to bring unity to the people in which they come to colonize. And they also need to figure out how to grow the economy, right? And so there are already some of these trade routes here. And if you look closely, which I realize you might not be able to see from where you are, but many of these little red dots exist right along rivers. So it makes sense that these are areas that have grown up along this part of the world. They're not predominantly Roman. They are people that have been colonized. They're the outer edges of the Roman Empire. And each of these cities has kind of a unique personality and a unique economy that is going to come up quite a bit in the letters to the 7 churches, right? This just offers a slightly different map so you can see a little bit more. This kind of gives you some idea about the Roman territory. So the Roman territory at this point, which was 200 before Christ, extended all through this area, right to the border of Armenia over here. This was a map this was the closest map that I could find that gave you a picture of that Roman territory. And then there's some protectorate down here. So the reason why this slide gives you an important picture as we make our way through the text is that Rome really is this expanding empire that has reaches far, far beyond the little city of Rome, right? And so it's important to kind of take that into consideration as we consider what it is that the church is going to be dealing with as they make their way forward. Here you can see the island of Patmos. So that's here, and that's where John receives this revelation. So here we have Ephesus, and Smyrna. So you can see that the churches that he's talking about are kind of north of him, but he is kind of way off on this island, isolated unto himself. And it's my understanding that Patmos is currently under the jurisdiction of Greece and is part of the nation of Greece. But at that time, it was part of Rome. All right, so 7 letters to the 7 churches. Let's just go ahead and begin to tear this apart a little bit. So in each of the 7 letters, and we've heard this from some folks that have mentioned it in terms of here's letter here, that pattern. There's a symmetry to each of the letters. We hear that when John refers to the churches, he talks about something that's going well with them most of the time. And he talks about something that is a challenge for them. And then he gives them an exhortation. He gives them something that they need to hear and to follow. And we're going to go through each one of these 7 churches, but I just have this here as kind of a slide to help us see overall what is happening, but we're going to go through them one by one to begin. There's also some other themes that come up in these letters. You'll notice that he keeps referring to this group called the Nicolaitans.
Yeah.
And the Nicolaitans, I have here, we don't really know too much about that specific group, but we do know that they were sort of infiltrating the area, and some of the speculation is that they were practicing idolatry under the banner of spiritual worship. And so we don't really know too much about what that means, but we know that they were worshiping in the way that John understood to be true worship. And so the Nicolaitans come up in more than one letter, creating some sort of trouble within the space. And I think it's helpful for us today to just know that maybe there's always a group that people are kind of worried about. You know, there's always that group that people are like, well, be careful about that group, right? And that might be different depending on where we stand in history. So I'm not asking us to speculate too much here. But here in this part of the world, the Nicolaitans come up. And what's interesting is that we don't hear anything about them again. So this was obviously a group that was very short-lived, a little bit of a splash in the pan. They could have been doing some worship practices, although we don't get clarity on them about what it is, what John disagrees with. Again, we don't know what those are, but we do know that they are causing some trouble. Oh, let's see. This is just a slide about Ephesus altogether. So I want to go through this a little bit more one by one. And let's get out our texts if you have them. And we're gonna look at these 7 churches. And one of the reasons why we'll spend a little bit more time with the churches is because, you know, the whole book of Revelation is powerful and has something to speak to us today. But these letters to the 7 churches are directed to living bodies of faith. They're directed to people that are trying to make sense of how to be the church in the day and age that they're living in. And so they speak uniquely to us because It's kind of like the letters that Paul wrote to his churches, it helps us to get a picture of how these New Testament apostles, because John was an apostle, exhorted the community to live in a way that was in accordance with God and Jesus. So this first one is the message to Ephesus, and I'm just going to read it just so that we can move forward. So it says, to the angel of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. So remember, we just saw that image. We see that thing come up a lot in the book of Revelation, where there's an image that's referred to, which you just saw previously. And so this is John's way of saying this is an authoritative message to the church of Ephesus. I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance. I know that you cannot tolerate evildoers. You have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them to be false. I also know that you are enduring patiently and bearing up for the sake of my name, and that you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love that you had at first. Remember then from what you have fallen, repent, and do the works that you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent. Yet this is to your credit. You hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Let anyone who has an ear to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Yeah, that's right. To everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat of the tree of life that is in the paradise of God. Okay, we're going to stop here. So you can see, just like we said in this previous slide, that there's going to be a symmetry to his letters. There is the positive, the thing that John says, here's what you're doing that's good. And then there's the challenge. And then there's the exhortation. And the exhortation is a little bit of a warning. And we'll see that in every single letter, where the writer offers this warning to the churches saying, but you need to do this or else. So let's just begin to kind of tear this apart real quick. So what is the achievement that has happened in the church of Ephesus?
Their hard work.
Their hard work. Good. Specifically, that you are enduring patiently and bearing up for the sake of my name. We haven't grown weary, right? So think about what that means for our churches today in terms of kind of doing that continual work over and over and over again. But I have this against you. You have abandoned the love that you had at first. So there's that challenge. There's that thing where the writer says, but here is where something is that you need to work on. And what is that last exhortation, that kind of challenge that's like, do this, kind of, this is part of the important work that you'll need to pay attention to.
Repent.
Yeah, repent, change, right? Yeah. So, and that's going to come up in each one of the churches, right? Here is something that you need to do to change. And then there's a promise that's attached to that too. So the promise is, to everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat of the tree of life that is in the paradise of God. Now, I want to keep going because what I want to do is kind of talk about each one of these churches together. So we're going to see if we can get through the 7. And if we can get through the 7, then we're going to have some discussion. So let's just hang in there, okay? We'll continue to kind of push forward. Second one is the church at Smyrna. Now, the church at Smyrna, it still exists today. It's in a town that's called Izmir. It had a temple to Zeus. It was the birthplace of Homer. Ancient coins describe the city as the first of Asia in its beauty. It was also a stronghold of emperor worship. And this comes up in a lot of the cities in which Paul is writing to, which makes sense because, again, just like we talked about last week, when you think about that map that I showed of the Roman Empire, you know, you can have an empire, but unless you have a way of bringing people together and of creating some sort of unity, you don't really have anything that's going to work. You're going to have people groups that are going to have infighting. You're not going to be able to iron out your trade routes. You're not going to be able to build successful infrastructure if there's dissension and if people aren't willing to comply
with the local authorities. So Rome had to have a way, and their way was emperor worship. Now, emperor worship looks a little bit different than maybe what we might understand, because what emperor worship was it was the claim that you could have many gods. So you didn't need to exclusively worship the emperor. You just needed to be able to say that the emperor was God. That was what you needed to say. You could also say that Zeus was God. You could also say that Aphrodite was God. You could practice lots of different religious rituals. But you had to be willing to admit that the emperor was a form of God on earth. And so this is one of the reasons why the early Christians, and this doesn't come up in Revelation, but it comes up later in church history, were called atheists. They were referred to as atheists because they did not practice worshiping any of those gods. They didn't practice worshiping the gods of these local temples, and they also did not practice worshiping the god who was called the emperor. And so because they did not worship those gods, they were thought of as atheists in the first century. Now, eventually that all changed when we had the emperor become a Christian empire. But until then, this was one of the things that continues to come up. So emperor worship was pretty strong within the city of Smyrna. And you'll see that, that even though there's a temple to Zeus there, there's still the importance of worshiping the emperor. Interestingly, if you know very much about early church history, Smyrna was the home to Polycarp, who was known as one of the earlier martyrs of the Christian church. And here is also where Christians endured fierce persecution from the Jewish community as well as from the Roman community. And this was one of the things that was starting to emerge here during this time of Revelation. So we think about this early church as someone or as a community that was dealing with the authorities of the Romans. But they were also starting to really have to deal with the authorities of the Jewish congregations. Now, the Jewish congregations were spread out all across those same areas where we showed that map. They had been there for years and years. Think about the Babylonian exile, how they were pushed up into like modern day Persia. And then as they came back, they settled in many of those different areas, which is why some of the Old Testament was written in Greek, some of it was written in Hebrew, or at least it was written in Greek over time, because so many of those Jewish communities, the diaspora, were out in that area that was Greek speaking, right? So in the beginning, the church and the synagogue are kind of the same thing, right? Even in the book of Acts, where do the apostles go? Where does Paul go when he shows up in a new place to teach the message? He goes to synagogues, right? And the synagogue is the place where the message begins to take shape. But as time goes on, the synagogue starts to say, this isn't us. Like what you're saying is not who we are. We don't want to claim that this Jesus that you're talking about is the Messiah that you're saying that he is. This is how it means. Jewish people already had kind of living and operating communities within their spaces. They were settled. This was another reason why the church felt like Christians, I should say, they were the kind of the beginnings of the church, but why the early Christians felt like they were always on the outside of culture. They had to be careful about the Romans, but then as time went on, they had to be careful about the Jews. They didn't want to bump into any Jews or cause any trouble in that sense either. And so that was one of the things that we see, not necessarily here in the letter, but we do learn with a little bit more history that there is a strong Jewish community there in Smyrna. And so that could be something that these early Christians are just kind of beginning to brush up against, not fully yet. And then this is helpful to know about the letter, and we'll see a little kind of sneak peek in each one of these letters. So Smyrna itself was known for these great athletic games in which the victor was given the crown And so what we see here in this letter is, that there is the allusion to the crown. And maybe we haven't read this one yet, so I'm gonna pick us up here in verse 8 and get us through Smyrna. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life.
And
I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Now, we're not always going to know what he's talking about when he says this kind of stuff. When he's talking about the synagogue of Satan, we're not clear about what that is. And remember, I didn't write it up here yet, but lean is better than luxurious. So sometimes it's better to just stand back and say, we don't know, but we're going to get the big picture. Okay, we're not going to assign synagogue to Satan to any particular group. That would not be good interpretation. Okay. So do not fear what you are about to suffer. Beware. The devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have affliction. And I'll interrupt myself here for just a second. This comes up a lot in Revelation 2. And as you're reading for next week, you'll notice there's always a limited day amount that the writer is talking about. Sometimes it's a certain amount of days. Sometimes it's 144,000 years. There's like a certain amount of years. There's 144,000 people, but then there's also, I think, 144,000 years or something like that. But anyway, there's these periods of time that come up, and you'll notice that every time they're limited. They do not last forever. They are not given into eternity. And so one of the main themes of Revelation is that suffering is going to take place, but it's going to be limited. It's not going to last forever. Suffering is not eternal. And in no way in this book do we see the eternal sphere contains suffering. And that's very important for this early church to know, because they are going to go through times of incredible trial wherever they are. And even if that trial isn't walking through something like the gladiator spheres, they are going to go through economic trial, because you can imagine what it would be like to have a business and then to be labeled as a Christian during that time. It could be very dangerous. You don't follow the emperor. What happens? If I patronize you, will that then target me? There's a lot of different things that are going on here that are under the scenes. And so what the writer says in these 10 days is that there will be affliction, but it's limited. It belongs to the land of creation. It doesn't belong to eternity. Okay. So beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested. And for 10 days, you will have affliction. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Remember, crown here is something that they would have been familiar with, because they knew that the person who received the winning, award from the race were given this crown as they stood upon, we could speculate, a podium, although we don't know for sure. But the idea is that this particular town saw that happen multiple times. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. A second death, again, is something that is going to happen later in the book of Revelation. We're not going to attach too much to it right now. One of the things that has to happen as you make your way through this book is it's almost like you're immersing yourself in this painting. You kind of just have to let it ride, or like you're sitting through all of Handel's Messiah. And there's times when you're like, wow, this is getting really heavy and I don't really know what part we're in. And then all of a sudden things will get really light and really loud, and then it'll get back down again and be a little bit more dissonant. So Revelation feels a little bit more like a symphony, or it feels a little bit more like an intense painting. And it's very important to let it be that way rather than to assign little bits of meaning here and there that then have to be gathered up by the church for all of eternity, right, as we move forward. That's one of the challenges with the book itself, is that everybody always wants to assign something to it, but those meanings often change from generation to generation. And so how do we continue to even gather that up after 2,000 years? All right, so let's go to Pergamum. Again, we're going to move forward through these 7 churches. And Yeah, we can do this. All right. So, and I'm gonna pick up here in the text, verse 12. And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know where you are living, where Satan's throne is. Yet you are holding fast to my name, and you did not destroy your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan lives. But I have a few things against you. And remember, that's the challenge. So we've just gotten through the positive part. Here's what you're doing well. Now we're going to get through the challenge. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel so that they would eat food sacrificed to idols and practice fornication. So you also have some who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Remember that came up in the last letter. Repent then. If not, I will come to you soon and make war against them with the sword of my mouth. Let anyone who has an ear to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. To everyone who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give a white stone. And on the white stone is written a new name that no one knows except for the one that receives it. I don't want to say too much more about this letter, except for one of the amazing things here is that this is this allusion to the white stone could be that you needed a white stone in order to go into a banquet hall. And that was seen as kind of like the fact that you had been accounted for that banquet. And yes.
Do you think that the large or the giant, temple or throne of Zeus in the Acropolis of that city was what he was referring to as Satan's throne?
Again,
Zeus.
yeah, and I don't know. Because this is a center of worship for Zeus, but not just for Zeus. As a matter of fact, you know, within this particular city, we see things like there was a temple to Athena, there was a temple to the god of healing and medicine. There was actually a lot of medicinal things that were happening within this town. And so what it is that he's referring to, we just don't 100% know. What we do know is that the church is in a place where it is challenged by the evil one. That's what we can say. And what that challenge looks like is going to be different for every specific place, but it's maybe less attached to a specific temple and more maybe attached to what's happening within the city, to where it is that people are practicing their worship and giving their lives over to, right? And that's the ongoing theme of Revelation is how do you worship and who do you worship? How do you worship and who do you worship? But this white stone thing, I just like that because in every letter we see a little picture of something that's going on within that city. And the white stone is associated with this town of Pergamum specifically. Again, I'll get these slides to you as we move forward. So Thyatira, that's the next one that's going to come up. As a former military post, it's under Roman rule. It's a place where there's a lot of artisans. So again, this is a different feel than that last city where we had a lot of temple worship. This is going to be a place where there's a lot of people who are doing mercantile work. And if you remember in the book of Acts where we meet Lydia, Lydia was from Thyatira, remember? And she was a purveyor of purple cloth. And so from this part of the world, they're doing a lot of that sort of thing. They've got, and the other thing about sort of that mercantile world, that world of the artisans, is that they had collectives and guilds. And if you had a collective and a guild, you had to be accepted into that collective and guild. And that collective and guild would then protect the business that then you could go ahead and patronize, people who could patronize you. And so the Christians were often precluded from being a part of these guilds for various reasons that we talked about previously. And that was something that they had to deal with. Let's go ahead and read this one. I'm going to pick up at verse 18. And to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God, who has eyes like flames of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your works, your love, faith, service, and patient endurance. I know that your last works are greater than your first. So again, that's what's going well in Thyatira. But I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet and is teaching and beguiling my servants to practice fornication and to eat food sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her fornication. Beware, now it gets a little bit violent here. I am throwing her on a bed, and those who commit adultery with her I am throwing into great distress unless they repent of her doings, and I will strike her children dead. And all the churches will know that I am the one who searches the minds and the hearts, and I will give to each of you as your works deserve. But to the rest of you in Thyatira who are not holding to this teaching, who have not learned what some call the deep things of Satan, to you I say, I do not lay on you any other burden, only hold fast to what you have until I come. To everyone who conquers and continues to do my work until the end, I will give authority over the nations to rule them with an iron rod, as when clay pots are shattered. Notice the clay pot illusion. This is the group of mercantile group people. Even as I also received authority from my Father. To the one who conquers, I will also give the morning star. Let anyone who has an ear to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. All right, so there's a lot going on with Jezebel there. And again, we're not going to make too much of it or dive too deep into it today. But what we do know is that one of the things that needed to happen, and Paul talks about this too, so this is not a new surprise, is that when the early Christians decide that anything is going to be clean, remember, just a little bit going back, they decide, okay, you can eat anything, but just don't eat the meat that has been sacrificed to idols. And that comes up, and if you read Acts 16, 15 and 16, that was that big council in Jerusalem where they have to make decisions about that. And that was where they ended up. And it was a very hard decision for the church in Jerusalem because it ended up creating a significant divide them from the local synagogue, because now they were bound to people who were eating other things except the meat sacrificed to idols, right? So it was a big thing for the church in Jerusalem, but that practice of the churches in the first century. And so what we see here is that there's likely a person, we don't know who, likely their name isn't Jezebel, but we see a lot of imagery that comes up from the Old Testament. We saw it before in that imagery for Balaam and Balak, right? That's that looking back to the story that happens in the book of Numbers. And then here, this happens in the book of Kings. And so there's these allusions to these Old Testament stories where the writer is sort of saying, this is not a great person. And there's some stuff happening here that you need to pay attention to. And likely it had to do with the whole idea of participating in a meal with meat that had been sacrificed to idols. Now, why did the Christians not participate in that? A few reasons. One, it was a way of them to step away from the worship of the day. These temples were places of religious practice that was engaged in different forms of sexual promiscuity, different forms of animal mutilation. Of course, they didn't see it that way. That was just part of the worship rites that were associated with these temples. But the church really had to kind of figure out, how do we distance ourselves from that form of practice? And that was one of the ways that they did that. It was one of their ways of kind of trying to figure out, how do we separate ourselves from folks within the world that we don't necessarily agree with. Now, you can argue that there's a different way of being Christian besides being separate from the world, but this was the way that the early church practiced that, especially as they went into different cities that had these Greek and Roman temples. Okay, well, we didn't make it through all 7 churches yet, but I want to take a break And I want to at least have you have a chance to talk. Because if I keep going too much farther, we're gonna lose our time for discussion. So what I'd like you to do is to get in those groups of 2 or 3 and just begin to reflect on some of the challenges that you've seen in these letters, some of the exhortations, and then the big question that I want you to wrestle with is, what is that saying for our church today? And I don't just mean Covenant, I mean the church in the United States, the church in the 21st century. What does our challenge need to be from these words? Okay, so a few more minutes and then we'll come back together and we'll get through the rest of the 7 churches.
Last part, back on this hour. And that's great, nice. What challenges might be on church today?
Reaching young people.
Teaching young people, just writing it down. And what makes you see that? I mean, I agree, I'm just.
Families with young people are just busy with so many other things and there isn't really time for church to fit into.
Right. So. Illuminating the relevance, maybe, is what you're saying. All right, other things that came up. Yeah,
Looking at, the immorality of our community
okay,
versus what the church is teaching. It's hard to get youth involved in something when the morality and the practices of the outside of the church have such huge ties on them. Like they're so into their phones, and they're so into, doing this, and having this posted.
Yes.
That they don't know that they're actually okaying that immorality by participating in it.
Yeah, yeah. And so this idea of how do we illuminate the relevance? How do we examine the morality of our culture when everything is hidden behind a screen? And when we can't seem to get in between the person who's viewing and the screen itself, especially among young.
And that relevance goes to false prophet.
Yeah.
Be wary of false prophets, all these false informations that we are bombarded with.
Yeah.
I think that is
Yeah.
the false prophet. They're prophesizing how our world is or how we should live.
Yeah.
And that's not what this says.
Yeah, yeah. So when, and I'll come to you in just a second. So when, there's all of these pointing of fingers, a lot of times the church does not want to interpret them. So you can see why there's not a lot of sermons preached on these letters. But if we don't get behind some of that and begin to unpack what it actually means, then we don't have the opportunity to illuminate the relevance of what it is that this message is about. Because likely the synagogue of Satan and the person of Jezebel and all of that, it's not just targeted person, it's a principality that exists within every generation. What is that principality? Greed, sexual pulling and lust. Lust, not just for sexual, but for money, for power, all of that kind of stuff continues to come up from generation to generation. And as a church, if we get so busy and say, well, this is the Mormons, it's like we've lost that ability to illuminate relevance, right? Instead, we are pinpointing and pointing fingers at other people instead of taking a broader look and saying, this is what the text is actually saying. This is what it's trying to say about our worship, about our hearts, about where it is that first desire comes from. That's what he's trying to help us get the picture of is come back to that first desire of your hearts. That's that way of coming around our morality. Yes, over here.
Yes, what we came up with was addiction.
Addiction.
Anything. Great. We're not going to take us away from, trying to live Christ-like.
Yes.
Studying.
Yes.
And so it could be video games, like my case, the little books.
Yeah.
I get all of my small ones. And, just anything in our lives that detracts from our attention to Christ.
Yeah. So we all these different forms of addiction. I love that. That's such a good way of helping us bring the text to life in a way that keeps its relevance and that makes it meaningful for the 21st century and gets to heart of what the writer is saying. Yes, over here.
The word hypocrisy just keeps coming up in my mind, especially with everything that we're talking about. It all kind of boils down to hypocrisy. We are called to be set aside and to behave differently, and yet most of us will proclaim to be Christians, but behind the scenes, and when we're not in church, are not behaving as if we are children of God.
So how do we live? And I wish I could take a comment. I'll talk to you afterwards. I have to bring us to a close. So we're not going to get through all of the 7 letters to the 7 churches. We are going to start next week with the close of the 7 letters so that we have a chance to transition after that. But for your reading, I'll ask you to pick up, let's see, I think I have. Okay, here we go. So their work is going to be to read Revelation 8:17, and then I want you to come next week, and at least you can think about it. You don't have to bring it or anything, but just you can think about a work of art or piece of music that was inspired by the book of Revelation, because there are so many of those out there. And we'll continue plowing through this. So think about those 7 letters. Think achievement, challenge, and then you get a little bit of a warning for the exhortation, and that's going to go through all of those letters. You can go back to them and just make sure that you take an honest keep an eye on that pattern. We'll pick up after the 7 letters next week. Thank you.
Thank you.